Okay, we are rolling.
You're rolling.
Yeah.
All right, it's Mike once again from brew-juice.com. Getting ready to wrap up our kegging series. We've talked about the kegs, we've talked about tanks, we've talked about connections and tubings and valves and refrigeration. We've talked about faucets. Now we need to talk about pouring beer. Now, you can look online to find carbonation charts. You're going to apply a certain amount of pressure, typically in the 10 to 15 psi range. It's dependent upon temperature. I'm not going to go through it all verbally because it really is something to look up online. Maybe we will post our own a chart of carbonation levels. But you measure carbonations by volume of CO2. It's a physical liter volume of how much CO2 is dissolving in the beer. The colder beer is, the more CO2 will absorb at any given pressure setting. But the place where most people get tripped up in their kegging system is they've done everything that we've talked about so far, and they've gotten all the way to this point. They put a glass under that handle, they pull the handle, and all they get is foam, or all they get is flat beer. And it's very disappointing because you're very excited, you want to pour that first draft, and it comes out to be less than stellar. So the big thing is how much pressure you're applying, and then what's happening to that beer when it exits the keg, right? So that part of the process is called balancing your system. Think of it this way, is that you've applied, say, 12 pounds of pressure to the beer in the keg with no hose attached to it on the exit. So the beer exists in that keg at 12 psi. It's just a concept. As the beer exits the keg and goes through the tubing, it's the same thing as opening a bottle of beer. Okay? Is that once you open a bottle of beer, if you leave it sit there long enough, it will eventually go flat. And the same thing is happening as the beer is traveling through the tubing and even going through the faucet, is that if there's not enough back pressure on that beer, the CO2 will come out of solution. And as it's running through the beer line, and as it's going through the faucet, there's a lot of turbulence created, and you get a lot of foam. So you can open that faucet, and if you haven't supplied the appropriate amount of back pressure, like a cap on a bottle, the CO2 is just going to come out of the beer. You're going to get a bunch of foam, and when that foam diminishes, your beer is going to be flat because all the CO2 escaped as it traveled from the keg to your faucet into the glass. So it's called balancing the system, and what you want to do is you want to provide the right amount of back pressure equivalent to what you put into the keg, or more back pressure than that. So if you've applied 12 psi to the keg, there are different size tubings. The tubing you want to use in almost all applications, like what I've showed you in my system, the inner diameter is 3/16 of an inch. 3/16 of an inch tubing provides roughly about 2 pounds of restriction or back pressure per foot. So if you've put 12 pounds of pressure in your keg, you need 2 pounds per foot. That's 6 feet, 6 times 2 being 12. That's 12 pounds of back pressure in the line, or we call that restriction. So now the amount of restriction in the tubing is equal to the amount of pressure in the keg. It's 12 pounds and 12 pounds. That's a balanced system. Now, just to be safe, I tend to run my lines a little longer than 6 feet. My lines right now are about 8 feet. What does that do to the final pour? That kind of slows the rate down of the pour, because the 12 pounds of pressure on the keg are pushing against 14 pounds of pressure if you used 7 feet of line, or in my case I use 8 feet of line. That's about 16 pounds of pressure. So why do I do that? It's because I just really don't like getting super foamy beer. It's extremely disappointing. So if you have a longer line, you're guaranteed to provide plenty of back pressure. You're not really adding that much more line length. And it almost guarantees a good pour. It's just that it takes a little bit longer to pour. And the reality is, when you have friends over, they're really going to enjoy pouring their own beer from a faucet, because most people haven't had that experience. So if it takes an extra 5 seconds to fill a glass, I don't think anybody's going to complain. So I'm always an advocate of going with a little bit extra beer line, a little extra restriction to prevent foaming and having a great pour. So the other thing that allows you to do is if you ever wanted to carbonate your beer higher for a different beer style, let's say you had a good Pilsner or an American Cream Ale or some Belgian beers that you wanted a higher level of pressure on, in other words, more carbonation in the keg, rather than have to go in and replace your beer line already is a little bit longer. So you could still have a balanced system despite the fact that you've put more pressure on the beer to serve a higher carbonated beer. I do a lot of English beers. I like my carbonation level to be somewhere around the 2.2 volumes of CO2. Standard American beer, I'm probably going to get this wrong, but standard beer in like a Budweiser can is like about 3 volumes, 2.5 to 3 volumes. Soda is pushing like 3.5 volumes, just to give you an idea of what kind of bubbles a volume of CO2 really generates. So that's basically it. You want to have the amount of pressure in your beer line, your restriction or your back pressure, to be equal to what you're applying in the keg, and that'll prevent foaming. It's just that simple. You want to keep your beer lines clean. You can get beer line cleaner. A clean beer line also helps prevent foam, just like having a dirty beer glass. If you've ever seen bubbles sticking to the side of the glass, or you pour a beer into a glass and it foams like crazy, it's usually because the glass is dirty. So dirty beer lines, that also generates foam. So keep it clean and things will keep running. And in the end, you end up with a great pour from your kegerator without a whole lot of foaming. So there's a perfect beer, perfect pour. Now you can enjoy draft beer at home. You can drink liters of beer, or you can just drink 4-ounce tasters anytime you want. It's ready to go. I hope you've enjoyed the kegging system. There's always more questions that will come up. Leave them as comments. Write to us. We'll always do our best to answer the questions. Get into kegging. It's far better to clean one big stainless steel bottle than it is to clean 50 small bottles. So brew on, and cheers.